I thought I was just a wife hiding a secret in my basement, but when my husband changed the Wi-Fi password to lock me out, he accidentally triggered a global blackout. Now, the walls of our home are dissolving, and the life I spent years curating is revealing itself to be a high-stakes prison I was never meant to leave. The silence in our house usually felt like a sanctuary, a comfortable shroud draped over the furniture we'd spent 5 years curating together. But tonight, it felt like an interrogation. I stood in the hallway, my phone illuminated by a ghostly blue glow, staring at the screen where the Wi-Fi icon mocked me with a spinning wheel of futility. Incorrect password. I tried again, then a third time. My thumbs hovered over the glass, the familiar muscle memory of the password, our wedding date followed by his initials, suddenly rendered obsolete. It wasn't just a technical glitch. Mark was a creature of habit. He didn't change passwords unless he was making a statement. He had been distant all week, burying himself in his laptop at the kitchen island, his jaw tight, his eyes flicking away whenever I entered the room. I had assumed it was the stress of his merger, the late-night calls, the phantom emails that required his immediate, solitary attention. I walked into the living room, the floorboards creaking under my feet like bones. He was sitting on the sofa, his back to me, the blue light of his screen reflecting against the window. He didn't turn around. He didn't acknowledge the shift in the air, the way I stood there holding my breath, waiting for him to offer an explanation for the locked door of our digital life. "Mark?" I said, my voice sounding thinner than I intended. "The Wi-Fi is down." He didn't move. He didn't even tap a key. For a long, agonizing minute, the only sound in the house was the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the foyer, a gift from his mother that I had always secretly hated. "I didn't forget, Sarah," he finally said. His voice was cold, polished to a surgical edge. "I updated it. You don't need access to the network anymore. Not for what you're planning." My blood went cold. What I was planning? I hadn't planned anything except a quiet Tuesday dinner and maybe an episode of that period drama we'd been binge-watching. My heart began to hammer against my ribs, a frantic bird in a cage. I walked closer, my shadow stretching long and distorted across the rug, but as I reached for his shoulder, he stood up abruptly, closing his laptop with a sharp, final that echoed like a gunshot. He turned, and for the first time in our marriage, I saw a stranger looking back at me. His eyes were devoid of the warmth I had built my life around, replaced by a calculated, predatory focus. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a small, heavy object, and tossed it onto the coffee table. It skidded across the wood, spinning until it settled, my own spare house key. "I know about the basement, Sarah," he whispered, his eyes locking onto mine with terrifying intensity. "And I know who you've been talking to." I didn't speak. I couldn't. The air in the room seemed to vanish, leaving me gasping for oxygen. How did he know about the basement? The keypad lock I'd installed 3 months ago, the one I'd told him was for craft storage, was strictly off limits. I'd been meticulous. I'd been quiet. I'd been invisible. Mark paced the room, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. He wasn't looking at me anymore. He was pacing like a man who had already won a war I hadn't realized we were fighting. "Did you really think I wouldn't notice the fluctuations in the power bill?" he asked, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "Or the fact that you've been spending 3 hours a day down there, surrounded by files that don't belong to our household?" My stomach churned. I had been careful. I had used a VPN. I had wiped my digital footprint, and I had ensured that every transaction I made was laundered through the shell company I'd set up weeks ago. I wasn't just a wife, and he was beginning to realize that the person sleeping in his bed had been a ghost long before he decided to change the password. "Mark, you don't understand," I began, moving toward the kitchen, my hand inching toward the drawer where I kept the heavy brass pepper grinder, a heavy object I could use if he decided to move closer. He stopped pacing. He looked at me, a cruel, knowing smirk playing on his lips. "I understand perfectly. You think you're the smartest person in this room, Sarah. You think you've been playing me for months." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a stack of manila folders, dropping them onto the coffee table right next to my key. But you forgot one thing. I'm the one who handles the security systems for this house, not you. My heart stopped. The security system, the cameras. You didn't just lock me out of the Wi-Fi, did you? I asked, my voice barely a tremor now. He didn't answer. Instead, he pulled out his phone, tapped a single icon, and the sound of my own voice, distorted and fearful, began to play from his device, echoing off the walls. It was a conversation I'd had 2 hours ago, in the dark of the basement, with a voice that was definitely not his. I backed away, heading toward the mudroom, realizing that the house I thought was my fortress had been turned into a prison. My fingers brushed the deadbolt on the side door, but as I felt for the latch, I realized it wouldn't turn. He'd overridden the manual bypass. I was trapped inside, and he was walking toward me with a look of pure, unadulterated malice. "You're right, Sarah," he said, stepping into the dim light of the hallway. "You've been very busy. But you made a mistake. You thought you were the one holding the keys." He reached for the light switch, and the house plunged into total darkness. In the blackness, I heard the faint of the exterior deadbolts engaging, one by one, a sound that signaled he wasn't just locking me in, he was sealing the perimeter. Then, from somewhere deep in the basement, I heard the heavy, metallic thud of the internal door swinging wide open, followed by the sound of someone, or something, walking up the stairs. I stood frozen in the mudroom, the darkness pressing against my skin like a physical weight. The sound of footsteps coming up from the basement was slow, methodical, and entirely too heavy to be a pet. My breath hitched in my throat. I had spent months ensuring that the basement was secure, reinforced, and soundproofed, yet the door, the one I had reinforced with a steel bar, was now wide open. "Mark, what did you do?" I hissed into the darkness, my hand fumbling blindly for the knife block I knew was on the kitchen counter nearby. There was no reply, only the low, rhythmic thumping of the footsteps reaching the top step. Then, a soft, synthetic chime echoed through the house, the sound of the security system's internal alarm being deactivated. Mark's voice drifted from the living room, calm and terrifyingly detached. "I didn't like the secrets you were keeping, Sarah, so I invited someone to help me uncover the rest of them. Someone who has been looking for you a lot longer than I have." A cold sweat broke out across my forehead. My mind raced through the names, the people I'd crossed, the identities I'd discarded. None of them should have been able to find me here. I had done everything right. I had changed my name, my face, my history. But as the footsteps reached the hallway, I realized the one person I had failed to account for was the one person currently standing in the dark with me. The kitchen light flickered once, then burst into a blinding, sterile glow. I shielded my eyes, squinting against the sudden assault of brightness. Standing in the doorway of the basement was not a monster or a hitman. It was a man in a gray suit, holding a tablet, looking remarkably bored. Behind him, Mark stood with his arms crossed, a look of smug satisfaction on his face. "Meet Mr. Henderson," Mark said, gesturing toward the stranger. "He's a private investigator, and he's been documenting your little project for weeks." The man in the suit didn't smile. He stepped forward, placing a tablet on the island. It displayed a live feed of the basement, my secret lab. Except it wasn't empty anymore. There were boxes I didn't recognize, files strewn everywhere, and a laptop sitting on my desk, open to a screen I had never seen before. "You're not just a traitor, Sarah," Mark whispered, stepping closer, his presence looming. "You're a liability, and Mr. Henderson isn't here to talk." I looked at the counter, saw the knife block, and felt a surge of adrenaline. If they thought they had me cornered, they were about to find out how wrong they were. I lunged for the knife, but as my hand touched the handle, the entire house suddenly lurched. A siren began to wail, a deep, low-frequency sound that rattled my teeth. Mark's expression shifted from smugness to genuine confusion. "What is that? I didn't trigger that." "I did," I said, a dangerous smile spreading across my face as I pulled a remote from my pocket. "You changed the Wi-Fi password, Mark. You thought that locked me out, but you forgot that the house isn't just connected to your network. It's connected to a dead man's switch I installed on day one." The house groaned as the heavy metal shutters over the windows slammed down, sealing us into a reinforced tomb. The silence that followed the slamming of the shutters was deafening. The house was now a bunker, the outside world effectively erased. Mark stared at the remote in my hand, his face pale, the arrogance evaporating into pure, unadulterated fear. Mr. Henderson had stopped typing on his tablet, his eyes darting toward the heavy, armored front door. "What did you do, Sarah?" Mark's voice cracked. "Open the shutters. The ventilation is going to cut off." "The ventilation is fine," I said, my voice eerily calm as I gripped the knife handle. "But we aren't leaving. Not until I know exactly how much you told him." I stepped toward the island, closing the distance between me and the investigator. He looked at me, then at the knife, and slowly raised his hands. "I'm just a contractor, lady. He paid me to find the data. I don't care about the rest." "That's the problem, isn't it?" I replied, turning my gaze back to Mark. "You always were curious, Mark. You always had to know what was behind the door. Well, now you're going to see. But once you see it, there's no turning back." I walked toward the basement door, gesturing for them to follow. Mark hesitated, his eyes wide with a mix of dread and morbid fascination. He knew he'd pushed too far, but he was too invested in his own discovery to back down now. He signaled to the investigator, and the two of them followed me down the stairs into the bowels of our home. The basement was cold, the air thick with the smell of ozone and old paper. I walked to the far wall, pulled a loose brick, and pressed the hidden sequence on the keypad. The wall didn't swing open. Instead, a section of the concrete floor retracted, revealing a narrow, spiral staircase leading even deeper, into a sub-basement I had never even mentioned to him. "What is this?" Mark whispered, his voice trembling as he looked into the abyss. "This," I said, stepping onto the first stair, "is why you should never change a woman's Wi-Fi password." I started to descend, the lights flickering as the sub-basement power kicked in. It was a cavernous space filled with servers, stacks of dossiers, and a high-tech communication hub. But it wasn't the equipment that made Mark stop dead in his tracks. It was the faces on the monitors. Thousands of them. Digital profiles, real-time tracking, bank accounts, and private conversations. Every neighbor on our street, every friend we'd ever had over for dinner, every family member. I reached the bottom and turned to face them, the blue light of the monitors casting long, distorted shadows across the room. "You wanted to know who I was, Mark? You wanted to know what I was planning?" I tapped a key on the main console and a video file began to play on the giant screen behind me. It was footage of Mark, taken from inside his own office, from his own laptop camera, dated from 6 months ago. He was talking to someone I recognized instantly. "I didn't just invite a private investigator into our home, Mark," I said, my voice cold as ice. "I've been monitoring you since the day we met, and I know exactly why you were trying to lock me out." As the video continued to play, Mark's jaw dropped. The person he was talking to on the screen wasn't a business partner. It was the one person he told me had died years ago. The one person he'd been hiding from me for the entirety of our marriage. And then, the door to the sub-basement slammed shut behind them, and a voice, a woman's voice, echoed from the darkness of the room, speaking my name. The voice didn't just drift through the room, it seemed to vibrate against the very foundation of the house, heavy with a familiarity that made my blood turn to slush. It wasn't just a recording, it was coming from the shadows behind the towering server racks, a soft, melodic chuckle that belonged to a ghost I thought I had buried under a mountain of falsified death certificates. Mark spun around, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. He looked at the heavy steel door, then at me, his knuckles white as he gripped the railing of the staircase. "No," he whispered, his voice trembling with a frantic, animalistic edge. "That's impossible. You died." "We were there, Sarah. We were at the funeral. I saw the casket." "Funerals are theater, Mark," I said, not taking my eyes off the darkness where the voice had emerged. "And you were always such a gullible audience." A woman stepped out from behind the cooling fans. She looked exactly like the photos I'd kept in my digital vault for years. Sharp features, eyes that held the same predatory intelligence I'd seen in my own reflection every morning, and a small, jagged scar running through her left eyebrow. She was wearing a trench coat that looked damp, as if she had just come in from a storm that didn't exist outside our shuttered walls. She held a small black device in her hand, a signal jammer. The ambient hum of my servers flickered and died. The monitors, filled with the thousands of lives I'd been tracking, blinked once and went black, plunging us into a gloom illuminated only by the emergency red lights that bathed the room in the color of a fresh wound. "You really should have checked the basement security protocols more thoroughly, daughter," the woman said, her voice smooth, like honey poured over shards of glass. I felt the air leave my lungs. Daughter. The word hung in the sterile air, heavy and poisonous. Mark looked between us, his mouth agape, his world collapsing into a pile of shattered lies. He had been playing detective, trying to expose my secret life, never realizing that he was just a pawn in a game that had started decades before he ever bought his first engagement ring. "You're late," I said, my voice steady despite the hammer-strike rhythm of my heart. "Traffic was murder," she replied, stepping closer. She ignored me and looked at Mark, her gaze drifting over him with a clinical, disdainful curiosity. "Did he actually think he could lock you out of your own domain, Sarah? Did he really think that changing a password would stop a system that runs on its own internal logic?" She reached out and tapped the console I had been standing at. With a sudden hiss of pneumatics, a hidden compartment beneath the desk slid open, revealing a heavy, metallic briefcase. It didn't contain files or money. It contained a biometric override key, a physical failsafe for the house's entire infrastructure. "Give it to me," she commanded, her tone shifting from casual to razor sharp. "I don't think so," I said, pulling a compact stun gun from my waistband, the one I'd kept strapped to my thigh since the moment Mark changed the Wi-Fi password. "Oh, Sarah," she sighed, shaking her head. "You learned everything from me, but you forgot the most important lesson. You never, ever threaten the person who designed the prison." She snapped her fingers. From the upper level of the basement, I heard the sound of heavy boots hitting the concrete. Not one, not two, but a dozen sets of them. I hadn't been monitoring the basement to protect myself from Mark. I had been monitoring it to keep them out. And Mark, in his infinite, arrogant wisdom, had unwittingly deactivated the external firewalls when he tried to seize control of the network. He hadn't just changed the password. He had opened the front door to a syndicate that had been hunting me since I escaped their training facility 15 years ago. Mark screamed as a red laser dot appeared on his chest. Then another appeared on my shoulder. "He's useless to us now," the woman said, looking at Mark with total indifference. "But you, Sarah? You're a legacy asset. It's time to come home." I looked at the briefcase, then at the staircase blocked by a wall of tactical gear and shadows. I realized then that the dead man's switch I'd triggered wasn't just sealing the windows. It was a countdown. I checked my watch. 45 seconds. "You want the legacy?" I asked, looking the woman in the eye as I gripped the handle of the briefcase. Then you can have it. I slammed my palm onto the emergency release, not for the doors, but for the chemical suppressant system I'd installed for fire protection. Thick, white vapor erupted from the ceiling vents, instantly obscuring everything in a dense, suffocating cloud. As the room erupted into chaos, gunshots ringing out into the mist, Mark's panicked screams, and the woman's furious shouting, I dove toward the secondary vent I had spent months excavating, a path that led not outside, but into the crawl space beneath the neighboring properties. I scrambled into the dark, narrow tunnel, the sound of the house's automated defense system, the real one, the one I hadn't armed yet, beginning to whir into life behind me. The heavy clanking of iron gears grinding together suggested that the entire sub-basement was about to be partitioned off by blast doors. I was halfway through the tunnel, the air thin and dusty, when I heard the metallic screech of the primary blast door closing. Then a voice came over the internal intercom, but it wasn't my mother's, and it wasn't Mark's. It was a cold, synthesized voice I didn't recognize. Intruder detected in Sector 4. Lockdown status, permanent. Oxygen depletion in 3 minutes. I froze. I hadn't programmed that message. I hadn't programmed that override. Someone else was in the house. Someone who had bypassed my own security to turn my bunker into a crematorium. And as I turned to crawl forward, I felt a hand, cold, gloved, and incredibly strong, clamped down firmly on my ankle. The iron grip on my ankle didn't just stop my progress, it yanked me backward with such violent force that my head cracked against the concrete floor of the crawl space. Stars exploded in my vision, a supernova of white-hot pain, and for a fleeting second, the world tilted into a sickening tilt. I gasped, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and the metallic tang of ozone, my fingers scrabbling against the rough, cold foundation of the house. I kicked out, my heel catching something solid, a face or a chest, and heard a grunt of exertion. I wasn't just being dragged, I was being harvested. "Don't bother, Sarah," a voice rasped. It was a man's voice, deep and devoid of any human inflection, sounding more like a machine grinding pebbles. "The vents are already sealed. The secondary override wasn't yours to control." I twisted my body, adrenaline surging through my veins like liquid fire, and brought the heavy, jagged edge of the briefcase down toward the voice. There was a sickening thud, followed by a wet, sharp intake of breath. The grip on my ankle loosened just enough for me to scramble forward, but I didn't get far. I found myself pinned between the low ceiling of the crawl space and the advancing shape of a man dressed in tactical black, his face obscured by a sleek, featureless ballistic mask. He didn't fire a weapon. He didn't even reach for a sidearm. He simply knelt there, blocking my only path of retreat, and tapped a holographic interface projected from his wrist. "Target neutralized," he spoke into a comms unit. "The asset is secure. Initiate Protocol 9. Protocol 9. My heart skipped a beat, a cold weight dropping into the pit of my stomach. That wasn't a syndicate command, that was a black site contingency. I had stolen that protocol years ago, hiding it in the deepest encrypted sectors of my drive, thinking it was a legend, a scorched earth policy used by the agency to erase an entire city block if an asset went rogue. "You're not with them," I wheezed, my voice sounding hollow in the cramped space. The man tilted his head, the lights on his mask pulsing a rhythmic, predatory red. "We aren't with anyone, Sarah. We're the cleanup crew, and you've been a very expensive mistake." Behind him, I could hear the muffled, frantic thumping of someone pounding on a steel door. Mark. He was trapped in the sub-basement with my mother, and they were both about to be erased alongside me. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't about the Wi-Fi password, or the secrets, or even the legacy. It was a purge. By changing the password, Mark hadn't just exposed me. He had tripped a digital alarm that reached all the way to the top of the food chain. I looked at the briefcase, my only bargaining chip. My thumb hovered over the red biometric sensor on its side. "If you move closer," I whispered, my voice trembling with a feral intensity. I trigger the upload. Every file, every name, every shell company linked to the agency. It all goes public. To every server, every news outlet, every personal device in a 10-mile radius. I become the most dangerous woman on the planet for exactly 30 seconds before I die. The man paused. The red lights on his mask flickered, his hesitation a victory I hadn't expected. "You don't have the clearance," he said, though his stance wavered. "I don't need clearance to burn the world down," I retorted, forcing myself to sit up despite the throbbing in my skull. I brought the briefcase into the light. "Try me." Suddenly, the crawl space began to tremble. Not the rhythmic shaking of a building collapsing, but a deep, resonant vibration that seemed to come from the earth itself. The man in the mask looked up, his posture shifting from calculated to alarmed. "What did you do?" he demanded. "I didn't do this," I said, a terrifying thought dawning on me. Outside, a high-pitched whine began to rise in volume, a sound like 1,000 high-speed turbines spinning at once. The floor beneath us began to glow, the concrete turning translucent as an immense subterranean energy source surged beneath the foundation. This wasn't a purge. This was an extraction. The man lunged for me, but he was too late. A blinding, searing light flooded the crawl space, turning the darkness into a sterile, white void. The walls of the crawl space didn't just crumble, they evaporated. I felt the air pressure change instantly, my ears popping as if I were being sucked into a vacuum. I looked down at the briefcase. The biometric sensor had turned from red to a brilliant, terrifying violet. "It's not an upload," I whispered, the realization finally breaking through the terror. "It's a jump." Before the man could reach me, the ground vanished. I felt myself falling, not down, but sideways, through a tear in the fabric of the room. As I tumbled into the shimmering void, I caught one last glimpse of the house. Mark, standing in the doorway of the sub-basement, looking up at the sky, his eyes wide with a horror that was no longer about his marriage. Floating above our home, suspended in the night air and pulsing with the same violet light as the briefcase, was a craft that defied every law of physics I had ever studied. It wasn't the agency. It wasn't the syndicate. And as the light consumed me, the voice of the woman, my mother, echoed one last time, not from behind me, but from inside my own mind. "You didn't really think you were the only one who escaped, did you, Sarah? Welcome home." Then, the world turned black, and when I opened my eyes, I wasn't in the house anymore. I was lying on a cold metallic floor, and staring down at me wasn't a man in a mask, but a face I hadn't seen since I was 6 years old. My own, reflecting back at me from a mirror, but with eyes that were glowing with the same pulsing, violet light. I lay on the metallic floor, the air smelling of ozone and something impossibly ancient, like static electricity captured in a jar. My head throbbed, but the pain was distant, secondary to the visual nightmare unfolding before me. The reflection in the mirror wasn't just a mirror, it was a digital interface, a high-definition window into another reality. The me in the glass tilted its head, a predatory grace to its movements that felt entirely alien to the person I had been only an hour ago. "You look so tired, Sarah," the reflection said. Her voice didn't come from the glass, it resonated inside my own skull, a dual-layered sound that felt like hearing my own thoughts spoken by a stranger. "Running from a life you didn't choose? Pretending to be a wife to a man who was nothing more than a glorified data collector? It must be exhausting." I scrambled backward, my back hitting a bulkhead that hummed with a low, sub-audible frequency. "Where am I? What did you do to Mark?" The reflection smiled, a cold, thin line. "Mark is exactly where he needs to be. He served his purpose. He was the catalyst. Every great shift requires an anchor point, and his obsession with your little Wi-Fi secret was the key to unlocking the perimeter. She stepped out of the mirror, not as a reflection, but as a solid physical projection, a construct of light and hard-coded ambition. Behind her, the walls of the room dissolved, revealing not the basement or the crawl space, but a vast, silent expanse of a ship's bridge, suspended in a void of swirling violet nebulae. The syndicate, the agency, the cleanup crew, they were all just layers of the same onion, she continued, pacing the perimeter of the room. They spent decades fighting over the scraps of a technology they didn't understand. They thought you were an asset, a runaway experiment. They never realized that you were the interface. I looked down at my hands. They were trembling, but as I focused, I saw the violet light flickering beneath the skin of my palms, following the rhythm of my heartbeat. I realized then that the basement in my house hadn't been a lab for me to hide in. It had been a receiver. I hadn't been building a fortress. I had been building a beacon. "I'm not a weapon," I whispered, the rage finally overriding the fear. I stood up, the metallic floor cooling the soles of my feet. "And I'm not going back to the grid." "You don't have to," she said, stopping mere inches from me. Her eyes matched the violet glow of the briefcase I still clutched in my hand. "The grid is burning, Sarah. Your little dead man's switch didn't just lock the house. It initiated a cascade failure in the global communications network. The internet is gone. The cloud is dissolving. The world you were so afraid of, the one that was tracking you, judging you, keeping you in a box, is currently turning to ash." I looked at the briefcase. The violet light was pulsing faster now. "What did I do?" "You freed yourself, and you broke the cage." She held out a hand. "But you can't navigate this new world alone, not when the remnants of the old one are still hunting for the source of the blackout." I thought of Mark. I thought of the way he looked at me before the white light took us, the genuine, pathetic confusion of a man who realized he was playing a game he hadn't even started. He hadn't been the villain. He was just another bug in the system. "If I take your hand," I said, my voice hardening, "it's not because I'm coming home. It's because I'm going to make sure no one ever builds another cage again." She chuckled, a sound that seemed to ripple through the very hull of the ship. "That's the spirit, Sarah. The first lesson of the legacy. The architect is always the one who decides how the building falls." I reached out, my fingers brushing hers. As our skin touched, the violet light surged, blinding and absolute, wiping away the memory of the house, the mudroom, the Wi-Fi password, and the woman I used to be. When the light faded, I was standing on a balcony, overlooking a city that looked nothing like the one I had left. The sky was a deep, impossible violet, and the buildings were spires of crystalline light, hummed with a power that felt like an extension of my own nerves. There were no cell towers, no surveillance drones, no screens. The world was quiet, but it was a quiet of infinite, terrifying potential. I turned back to the room. The reflection was gone. In her place sat a single terminal, glowing with the information of 1 billion disconnected lives. I walked to it, my hands moving with a fluid, pre-programmed expertise I didn't know I possessed. I didn't need a Wi-Fi password anymore. I didn't need a door lock, a bunker, or a secret life. I looked down at the interface. The entire world was at my fingertips, waiting for a single command. I smiled, the reflection in the screen showing not the woman who had been trapped in the suburban house, but a deity looking out over her first morning of creation. I typed one final command, hit enter, and watched as the last remnants of the old world flickered out of existence forever. I wasn't just Sarah anymore. I was the signal, and I was finally, irrevocably, online.